What happened at the funeral that night made everyone shocked. The scene was set for a somber funeral as mourners gathered to pay their final respects to the departed. But what began as a solemn affair quickly turned into a heart-stopping moment when a wolf unexpectedly latched onto the throat of the deceased man. The remarkable bond between humans and animals was revealed in a way that left everyone in awe. In today's story, we'll see that during the funeral of the wolf that grabbed the dead man, and then something shocking happened. Before we jump into the video, welcome to Animals Affection. Here we provide you with the most interesting and fascinating stories that will make you cry and happy. So without wasting our time, let's dive right in. Alaska is a place that makes homesteading and people who live off-grid, close to cities, seem like they're living in luxury with a lot of modern solutions. Yet so many people who love the land and couldn't imagine living their lives anywhere else. That was the dream of one man, Thomas, who made his home in the wilds of Alaska. He lived about half an hour away from the nearest town, if you could even call it a town. It is more of a settlement where few people gather to sell their homegrown products and interact, but to buy most supplies. Or for any other needs, the people in the area would have to fly out to one of the larger towns much further away. Thomas loved living in the area. He loved watching bears, salmon fighting in the river, and all the wildlife that would move past his cabin. Thomas hunted, but only to survive, and he had a deep respect for the creatures in whose land he lived. It is also a land where many still leave traps out in the open. Some even still set traps for bears, to use their skin for blankets and their meat for food. One day while Thomas was out hunting, he heard a strange sound. It sounded like howling and crying. It was clear something was in terrible distress. Thomas moved closer and cautiously. He wanted to help, but an injured animal could be one of the most dangerous. He needed to be really careful there. Under a tree, he was met with a heartbreaking sight of a young wolf puppy caught in a bear trap. His legs seemed to be broken, and she was in incredible pain. Thomas looked around for the rest of the pack, but it was nowhere to be found. They couldn't help her, and it seems they had abandoned her. Thomas knew he had to help the little wolf with a lot of effort. He finally opened the trap and released the wolf. Instead of running away, it just kept lying there. It was exhausted from the struggle and too tired to move. Thomas gave her some water and cared for the injured leg, and he hid behind some trees to see if the pack returned. But no one came after some few hours. He knew he couldn't leave the injured animal all alone. He then took the little wolf back to his cabin, where he fed her and checked her leg. He called the little gray wolf Grace and tended to her. As Grace grew, Thomas allowed her to wander the wilderness. She wasn't a pet, more of a guest until she was well enough to leave. Grace would go with Thomas to hunt and proved to be a great fishing partner. They formed a bond. But the wild bond that ran in Grace was stronger than the love she had for the man that saved her. When she was finally fully grown, she stayed out longer eventually. She would come back home less often, and she finally didn't come back at all at the next time. The Thomas saw her running in the wilderness. She had joined a new pack of wolves. She was once again a wild wolf living in the forest. It was bittersweet for Thomas, but every now and then he would often see a glimpse of Grace and her family out in the wilderness. There were even little Graces running around later on. It was so great to see, but often he wondered if she even remembered him. What would happen if they ever met again face to face? It had been a few years, and Thomas was still living off the land. It had been a tough season, and there wasn't a lot of food around. Thomas went out exploring the wilderness. He saw a bunch of berries and was tempted to eat them, and he reached out and grabbed them. They didn't taste nice, but food was scarce, and he chewed them down regardless, just as he swallowed the fruit. He realized the berries might have been toxic, but he was hungry and took a chance. He felt certain that he would be fine had he eaten the berries before. After all, but as he walked home he became increasingly dizzy, and the world was spinning, and he felt faint. He knew he had to act fast and get to the nearest people. He was on foot and had to reach a vehicle finally. Making it back to his cabin, he went to his truck and drove the distance to the settlement. As he got closer, he felt the air leave his body. Everything got fizzy, and he passed out. The people around just saw Thomas slumped over his car, and they didn't know what was happening. Quickly they got him out, but it seemed to be too late. Thomas was gone. What had killed him? How did he die? No one in the settlement knew, but if it was an illness that killed him, they would need to take him far away. To make sure that they didn't get sick, They wanted to show respect and arrangements were made quickly for the funeral. The townspeople would lay Thomas to rest as soon as possible and start digging a grave. As it was coming underway, the weather turned for the worse. Strong winds and a downpour of heavy rain suddenly occurred, causing the men to stop digging. They had to wait until the thunderstorm had passed. Thomas's body has been wrapped up in blankets and was left in the open shed outside. It was cold and a long night. The next morning the weather was pleasant again, and the men continued to prepare Thomas's grave. No one had a coffin handy, and so he would be laid to rest with just the blankets covering him. The townspeople then gathered for a small funeral service. Then they picked Thomas's lifeless body up and started carrying him to his final resting place. Suddenly the people were surrounded by wolves. It was Grace and her family. Did she come to pay her respects? Did the pack of wolves want to attack the people? It was a scary situation. Grace was growling at the men carrying Thomas. Her growl intensifies as she moves closer to the grave. Scared of what the wolf might do, they set him down and moved away. Some people were even getting their guns ready. But first they waited to see what the wolves did next, as they slowly laid the body down on the blanket slid, uncovering Thomas's face. Grace moved in closer and licked his face. She seemed to be listening to something. It was a few seconds filled with tension, and then she suddenly grabbed the body by throat. Lifting up his head, it tilted it back and suddenly Thomas started breathing again. It seemed like a miracle. The wolves disappeared and left the humans to care for Thomas. He was quickly put on a plane and sat down to get medical support. There, they treated him and got him back on his own feet. It all must have felt so surreal, but the doctors had a good explanation. When humans become unresponsive, their muscle relax and their tongue can block their airway. Your heartbeat can become so faint so much as human ears might not hear it. Without the proper gear. But a wolf could tilting Thomas's head opened his airway and he could breathe again. He was kept in the cold and that preserved his life. In the end, nature, man, beast all had a helping hand in Thomas to live again. It wasn't long before Thomas was well enough to return to his beloved wilderness. The town all greeted him as he got off the plane. It was as if the man was returning from the dead, a walking miracle. And one they were really grateful that he had not been buried sooner. But a bigger surprise waited at his cabin. As soon as he set foot inside, a familiar shadow appeared in the doorway. It was Grace. She jumped around and greeted Thomas like a happy puppy, welcoming her human home. It felt like the old times, and she just as quickly as she came, she left, back to join her pack. He had saved her once a long time ago, but now she has saved him. Ever since then, Thomas and many other townspeople would make sure that Grace and her pack would have food when the dry season made it hard to survive. So, that's it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channels for more videos. Till then, take care of yourself. See you in our next video.